It's our pleasure to be here with Gwen Moore, who served for 16 years from 1978 to 1994 as an Assemblywoman in the California legislature. During that time, she served on every major committee in the California Assembly and chaired a very powerful committee on utilities and commerce. Today, Gwen has her own company. She is CEO and founder of the GEM Communications Corporation, which is a public affairs consulting group specializing in legislative and regulatory issues. And it's really good to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this. And it's a conversation about you as a pioneering leader in politics and some of our memories about women in politics in those old days and even in the middle days. And it's great to have you here. And I realized as we were thinking about doing this interview that for all the years you and I have attended meetings together and visited together at meetings, and for everything that I know about your legislative life and career, which is certainly not everything, and probably we'll find out a little bit more today. But for all that, I don't really know the background before that. And you were one of the pioneers, you're still one of the pioneers, and I want you to fill that in a little bit for me and for the record. And that is, how did you get there? Where did you come from? What kind of family background? What kind of schooling? When did you think about running for office in the first place? I don't think I've ever asked you that question.
I think you're right. I don't think you ever have. You just asked a whole bunch of questions in one.
A whole bunch of them, right.
Basically, I from the Los Angeles area in California, and started out as a probation officer, and went through a probation training leadership program, and went on to become a probation officer. Actually working with went into a program that actually taught community and worked with community folks in terms of being citizen kind of liaisons with the probation department. I also taught at a community college, social problems, so to speak, and became an intern. At the time, Senator Mervyn Diamond, who went on to become congressman, and lieutenant governor, had a urban leadership program where they provided a scholarship for a master's degree, and I went to SC on one of those scholarships, and part of your duty was to work with or be assigned to a politician. And I was assigned to Yvonne Braithwaite Burke and Leon Ralph, you know, at two different levels. And so obviously it kind of whet my appetite. And when a position became available on the community college board in California, which was a very popular position, it's where Jerry Brown and a few others served prior to moving on, I was elected to the community college board in Los Angeles County, and thereafter to the legislature.
So when you worked for Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, who was another pioneering woman in politics, she was in the Congress when, what, in the early 1970s, I think it was.
She was in the Assembly. She was the first African-American woman to ever be elected to the California State Assembly, and served, actually she and March Fong Yu were roommates.
Huh.
And early, in mid-60s, I guess, and then went on to Congress from there, and then ran for it, and is now back again, of course, as a member of the Board of Supervisors in
Los Angeles. So she's, her career goes on as well. So you worked with her, and that's...
As a student intern.
As a student intern. And
can you take us back before then to your own family and growing up? What kinds of issues presented themselves to you at that point, or did they, about public service and serving in the legislature, or were there inspirational examples from your family, or?
Well, actually, my family were, obviously were very inspirational. My dad was a restaurant owner and owned several restaurants. My mother was an English teacher, which was very helpful, of course, when I got elected to the legislature, because my son had his built-in tutor in the form of his grandmother to really kind of help him through the process. But and some of my strongest supporters, of course, were my family, and I guess no one could beat my dad in terms of keeping up with all the politics and really a real sounding board to what people were really thinking about issues and problems. And so they were very active, actually, in the Democratic clubs, both of my parents.
So the family was a politically active or interested.
Right, and so clearly from very early on, I had some interest in
Support
politics.
right there.
So when you decided to run, how did that happen? How did that come about? When was that at first?
I first ran for the Los Angeles Community College Board of Trustees, and I
Right.
had been teaching at a community college
Right.
level and saw a lot of things that perhaps needed to be done. And people talked to me. It was the same time shortly after when I had been the intern. And so a lot of people thought it might be a good idea for me to get my feet wet, so to speak, in politics. And the community college board seemed to be I didn't want to leave home. And it was a local, and it would give me an opportunity to really do and appreciate some things about politics. It was even more interesting because my running mates at the time, there had never been a Democratic majority on the school boards, and so there was the LA Community College Board, which had jurisdiction over the community colleges, and the LA Unified School District. And so we decided for the first time to make it a team approach run. So my teammates in that run were, on the community college board was Ira Reiner and Alex Asento. Ira, of course, went on and became the district attorney for LA County and a number of other things. And the school board members were Diane Watson, Kathleen Brown Rice, and we all ran our first campaigns together as a team. And so it was, I can still remember some of those days, and all we hoped for was that it would soon be over. That we had to go to so many places because it's such a huge district, and it ran all the way, it's like almost 700 square miles or whatever it is. And so we had to go all over LA County for these meetings at night. And so we would all go together, Diane and Kathleen and myself.
Diane is now in Congress.
Diane is now in Congress, and Kathleen, of course, ran for governor.
She ran for governor, right? And so you were all together in those days. Was that, I mean, that was a time before the subject of women in politics was as popular as it.
This was in 78?
Yeah.
No, actually 70.
Before
70,
that, right?
Yeah, like 72, I guess.
Yeah, it was in the very
75.
the very early days. Now, what was your sort of personal understanding of what you were doing? Did you think that it was a very pioneering and different thing to do? Were people surprised because you were women?
I think that there was some sense of that. I think that we had a lot of questions that kind of related to that that I'm sure now would never be asked. What do you do with your child while you're going to do these things? And of course, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. But you do a lot of parenting by phone. I'm moving on to the legislature from the community college board, and my son was like 6 when I got elected. And I can remember I used to kind of lay out his clothes, so he would kind of know, and he liked to match. And I can remember getting this urgent call from my son in the legislature that his dad was not letting him match, and that he was not matched. And it was the funniest call because he was just so upset that my husband was, one of these deals, put on this, let's go. Now we gotta go, we're running late. But it just disturbed him to no end. But you do a lot of parenting by phone, and I think a lot of the issues that were then are no longer now, because it's a lot easier for women to run, a lot more acceptable, not so unusual.
How many women were in the California legislature when you entered? Do you remember?
When I first was elected, there were only like 2 or 3 that were already there. And my class brought in a sort of a much bigger group, and I think we ended up with like 8 or 9 Of course, now those numbers have changed considerably.
Now they're up, I understand from your statistics at the center, 28%.
Yeah,
which is
something
as
like
high
that,
as
if
they've
not more.
Mhm.
The dynamics have changed considerably in terms of the roles that women play.
Uh-huh.
What do you remember about the dynamics then?
I think that a lot of it had to do with, first of all, term limits has, of course, made a lot of difference in the roles that women will play. But in coming into the legislature at that time, seniority played a big part.
Mhm.
And since there weren't a lot of women who were senior, they were not in many chairmanships or leadership kind of roles. Although California was open to that kind of thing, it just hadn't happened at the time. And so that's one of the things that's interesting and intrigues me about term limits, that you get a whole lot of people that start off equal
Mhm.
when you think about it, in terms of not having had the experience or the longevity that was required at one time to do anything.
Right. One of the things that I noticed in reading about your very distinguished career in leadership is the extent to which you were in very powerful positions. You were in practically every committee that of any importance. You chaired major committees. And it reminded me, I heard a California state legislator, a woman, recently saying, you know, I didn't get it right. She was someone who was being pushed out because of redistricting. She said, you know, I felt that the most important thing to do was to pay attention to policy. And while I was paying attention to policy, there were those around me who were paying attention to power. And they were the ones that in the end were moving into the appropriate positions, and I got outmaneuvered. And it seemed to me when I looked at your career, Gwen, that you were looking at both policy and positive policy issues that would make a difference for lots of people, but you were not unaware of power. How was it that early on you kept your eye on both those things?
It's kind of interesting because I think that you're right, you do have to look at both. When I was elected to the legislature, it was the first time that Republicans outnumbered Democrats in recent time at that time. And I can remember that we had a freshman class that we decided that you know, freshmen always think that they're the first ones to do anything, and that we were going to be together, and that we were freshmen regardless of party, and we were going to all work together. So we decided that we would have co-chairs of the freshman class, and so I was elected from the Democrat 8, and there were like 16 Republicans and 8 Democrats. And so from then on, I kind of fell into the loop of when they were looking for leadership, because I was majority whip for like 4 years in the legislature. So I think that you kind of have to look at both, and it's in moving your agenda, you have to have a certain amount of power. And certainly when leadership begins to develop, and it's one of the things we were talking about earlier today with some of the women, you begin to develop your expertise, and people will respect you for what you know, and you can make a difference. People were lamenting about not being able to get to be chairman or not having chairmanships, and so the point that we were attempting to make with them was that you don't have to be the chair to have power in the committee. Knowledge can give you some of the controls that you really need. And that if you learn your issues and become known as someone who is knowledgeable, people will come to you.
Could you talk about what were some of the toughest challenges that you had during those years, and did they change over the years? Or were there certain issues that were just always there that were obstacles? I also want to ask you about what made you proudest of the time you were there, but
I think that the question you ask is one that that we all kind of all through the process are always, in terms of being elected, there are always those issues that you really believe in, and there are certain issues that are non-negotiable. At least there should be. Sometimes it makes you wonder when you look look at some folks and you wonder, but you gotta stand for something.
Mm-hmm.
And so you sort of pick and choose your issues, and then there's certain things that are really important. In developing your legislative agenda, you have to be aware of those things that are important to you and where you draw the line. And then you can begin to put together an agenda that allows you to pursue those things that you care most about, but also to generate support for those things by helping people with some of the things that they care about. And I think one of the hardest things for people to do is to make those distinctions. And so it's something that whenever I talk to people about political careers, it's something that I always talk to. And it's always kind of funny to me that a lot of people never really thought about that and really can't tell you what are the most important things for them in terms of what they want to accomplish legislatively.
So they're running for office and haven't really looked at that.
Well, they have issues. You know,
Right.
like, I mean, you have an issue that schools, and you want to make sure that schools get their money and different kinds of things like that. But just some of the one-on-one kinds of things that you want to move an agenda where people have better access. Access is another issue that people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all kinds of access and how you want to move people in terms of having access and what it takes to get people to a certain level in doing that. I got real involved in minority and women-owned businesses and wanting them to be able to have access. Using my chairmanship of the Utilities and Commerce Committee, where utilities spend a ton of money when I've, in terms of things, but it was the old boy club. People that they'd always done business with, always done work, never really looked around. Well, I tried to approach it from the point that diversity of supply was good business. You could get, people would have an opportunity to get ratepayers who had no voice in it, would have an opportunity to get better prices, and they get better prices. And so it was to that end. And when I became the chair of the committee, as I was saying earlier, that I noticed that suddenly a lot of the people that were lobbying who had never lobbied for the utilities began to look like me, were either women or people of color, and they would send them in. Yet a lot of them still didn't have any real power. So in a meeting that I had with some of the CEOs, I said, what do you really consider a level that you compensate people who really make decisions for your company? And so they gave me a figure. So the next time I had a hearing, I said, I don't want anyone to talk to me that doesn't make X amount of money because they're not a real decision maker. And I want people who can make decisions. And so I heard from a lot of the women and some of the people of color who were lobbying, all of a sudden they got these strange raises that didn't make a lot of sense, but it put them over that threshold dollar that I have. I like to think I made a difference for some of those folks, but again, you make people really begin to look, because what had happened in the past was they simply sent people in who looked like you with no real power, no real authority, and figured that because they did, that you would kind of go along with the program. So I think that there are a lot of things that we begin to learn and begin to watch. And the longer you're there, now that's the difference between term limits and not having term limits.
That's right.
The more aware you are of all these kinds of things.
Do you think it's a big loss?
Of course. I really do. When I see, one of the things that bothers me most about term limits is I find that people are less likely to take on the tough issues. And for a variety of reasons. One, they know that they're not, or feel that they might not be able to resolve it. I can remember taking on issues that took me 6 or 7 years to really be able to work. Most are looking to move to higher office and feel that somehow if you take on a tough issue and it doesn't go anywhere, or it's controversial, then it will affect your ability to move to the next step or the next office. And so they don't take it on. And I think that's a real disservice, and I really worry about what's going to happen on some of the real tough issues that are not popular. Are we going to get them resolved, and what's going to happen with them? And this notion of putting things aside for the next group, they're going to run out of space to put them.
And then there's the issue, of course, of institutional memory.
Which is a big one.
Yeah, it is a big one. and of the elected officials themselves not being really as informed as all the staff people who get to stay.
Well, I think that's probably true because they have the institutional memory and they know where a lot of things are, and so people could become to depend on them. But again, it goes back to people really wanting to learn and know the issues. And I think that you can, if you give yourself an area that you really want to work on, and I think it's a must that people really have to do. But staff is going to lead as long as they're there longer than the legislators.
Elected legislators.
Did you develop fairly early on the set of issues that you stuck with, or did you discover an issue or two fairly late in your career that became much more prominent in your interests?
I think that women and people always go with issues that whether you came with them or not, somehow they find you.
Mm-hmm.
And you not only represent the district that from where you come, you represent people that look like you everywhere, and women look to women to to carry issues. We're not always aware of as how best to use the issues, because I know that there's some people that will follow you around forever, and there are others that are respectful and won't even come up and talk to you and have the same issues. And so part of it is even educating citizens about how to use the process, and that was something that I was really concerned about and started to do some work on at the end. But your question was, did I have issues that I came with, or did they kind of develop? I basically had some issues that dealt with access and ensuring that access was occurring, and you can find that in any of the areas. All the committees I served on, access was always somewhat of an issue, that you were always looking for ways to create that access for people who traditionally had not had it. And so it's sort of an underlying element of my whole career was doing that kind of thing and opening the door for people.
What about public policy issues? What were the most passionate ones for you?
Oh, I had so many. I did rape. I did.
You did fact, rape?
Yeah, I did. I had. I passed more. I had more laws signed into law than any other legislature during the period I had. I had something like 400 and something laws that were actually signed into law. But the MORE Act, which is the California Lifeline, which provided lifeline telephone service to folks, was a real important one to me. One of the ones that dealt with insurance and ensuring that people were not redlined, and some of the things that dealt with that, and then just some of the access issues. General Order 156, which said that utilities would do the outreach for minority and women-owned businesses and things like that. Those are things that are still in place, that are still making a difference for a lot of people, and I think that one thing that all legislators always strive to do is something that's going to make a difference when you're not there.
Absolutely.
So I still run into people on the street that tell me that, or run into people who still think I'm in the legislature and want me to do something for them. And I go to the grocery store, and I didn't know you went to the grocery store. Well, how else does my family eat, But
Do you miss it?
sometimes. Not a lot. I took a lot of my staff. I was fortunate enough to, when I left the legislature, that my business took off early enough, and a lot of the folks that worked from the legislature went with me. And I think a lot of them are a lot like the private life a lot more. They don't get the calls in the middle of the night. They don't have to go to things. They don't have to be nice to people. When I first got elected to the legislature, one of my constituents wrote me a very nasty letter, and my staff responded in kind. And I just about died, of course, and it was one of those kind of things. I could see this guy floating this letter around. Is this the kind of person you want to represent you? And now they have the freedom to not have to put up with those kind of things. And we had a lot of constituents that it was kind of nice when we left office. They found us and would call us. In fact, was one guy that was so anti-everything that he would call to see if we were working on Martin Luther King's birthday. He just wanted to be sure that we didn't get that office. But he was the nicest guy, and he wrote me the nicest letter that we still have when I left office. He said he didn't agree with me on anything, but he knew one thing, that I had his interest at heart, and I just, I thought that was
Well,
kind
you
of
know, hearing this and hearing the challenges that were there for you and some of the tough times, and you can find them amusing now, but I wonder, when I hear a legislator, I heard a woman talking about her daughter. She's been in the legislature. I forget which state it was. I heard her a while ago, but she was saying that her daughters are very proud of her, but they say, "Mom, I could never go through what you went through." And for those of us, I'm an educator trying to encourage young women to consider public service and consider running for office. And when I hear accounts like that, and of course I hear the voices of those young women saying, it's so hard, I think these women who've run for office successfully and there are saints of some sort for all they put up with. What do you have to say about that? And how would you address a young woman who is saying, I think it's going to be easier in the private sector than it is running for office?
It probably is, but the rewards are not the same.
Uh-huh.
And you can't, if you have a desire, and you really have to want to be a public servant to really make a difference. If you really care and you really want to make a difference, it is tough. Nothing's easy though, and no one ever promised anybody that it would be easy, and it is tough. But there's so many rewards along the way, and I think that's why so many people stay in it, because you can see some of the differences you make. Sometimes it takes a long time, but you can. When I ran for Secretary of State, of course, and lost. And but one of the joys of it was my son took a year off from college to be my driver, and I think he appreciated. I was, you know, one of the things for me was he always seemed to be so indifferent to what was going on in the political process. For me, I was just amazed at what this kid knew and understood about politics. And clearly, all those times that I thought that he was indifferent, he clearly was not. And he grew up literally, and because when I was elected first, he was 6. And I mean, all the people, and of course, all the legislators and everybody knew him from when he was little, you know. And here he was, this big guy, 6'5", and all this, and 6'5", and but I mean, he was so sharp in terms of remembering people who were at the things, remembering who were my supporters and who were not my supporters, or who I might think is my supporter, who really wasn't my supporter. And it was just great. And it just really was, it was just really nice to kind of see that. And I think that a lot of people, and a lot of kids that know that it's hard, but they still also kind of recognize the rewards and the different parts of it. And so I think sometimes it's a lot easier to say how hard it is than to really recognize what was really nice about it. And so it was really nice for me to see that and I also thought he was going to be a chauvinist, but he clearly is not, and is very much for equal rights and all that.
What's he doing?
He's a technician with, an engineer with SBC, and he does telecommunication networks and that kind of stuff. So he's, and I have a grandson who is bad.
How old is your grandson?
2.
You have a 2-year-old grandson?
2.
We share something then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Bad?
No, energetic.
Okay, well you can say energetic, I'll say bad.
High energy. Keeps us all running. But I just asked because when you said 6'5", I was trying to picture whether he had, become a basketball star or...
No.
That's very tall.
No, he hurt his knee playing basketball.
Oh, he did?
So,
He played?
Yeah, so he's, but he's very happy with what he does, and he's just a computer nut, so. Yeah.
I'm interested in this whole issue of computers and that enormous project that you headed in getting a consortium together of underserved communities in the state. It seemed such a genius idea that could be so replicable in other areas. How has it worked out, and how did you decide to take that one on? It seems a huge project and a very exciting one.
Well, when I was in the legislature, of course, one of the things that we did was we said that anytime there's going to be a merger of companies, that there ought to be some benefit for consumers. And in doing that, when SBC decided to merge with Pacific Bell, we thought that there ought to be something, and we thought there ought to be some consumer groups. So a consortium of 130 agencies came together and met and decided to work to help them to do it as long as these things were going to go through. And as a result of it, we got a commitment that they would continue the corporate donations at the same level that they'd always been, and in fact increase them, that there'd be no jobs that would be lost, instead jobs would be created, that there would be a community technology fund for underserved communities that would be paid at a rate of $5 million a year for 10 years for a total of $50 million. And this was to bring all kinds of technology. And that the signatures of this agreement would serve on the initial board. And I chaired that foundation as a result of us putting it together. And we're giving out money for all kinds of things, for access, again. A lot has to do with some of the depth.
Underlying themes.
All the
access.
things that I've always had, and this has really given us an opportunity, and it's working very well. And we had representatives from every community, they're like, on the board there's like 15, and there were some groups that weren't represented that we then included on the board. We also didn't want to be seen as a tool of SBC, so we formed a private foundation, which has the oversight over the entire thing, so the fund is only a part of it. And so we're in the process of seeking other grants, and just got a huge grant from the Wellness Foundation and some other things. So we're moving along, and hopefully that will be big. That's with the telephone company. I also serve on the Cates Foundation, which is the cable television's board, where they look to bring diversity into the industry. And that was created out of California. It's now a national board as well. And was appointed as a lifetime member of that as one of the founding persons of that. So we do a lot with foundations. And again, it's still about access, and still about having people to have access to resources and information that they would normally have.
Yeah, you did. That's a theme. It's really a theme throughout your legislative career, and it's a theme in everything else that you've done as well, the issue of access. And you yourself are evidence of new access for women and for women of color. And it's a tremendously important, I think, theme for our time, Do you remember some of you're such an upbeat person, Gwen, and I want to believe that you never had a rough moment, but I can't. Do you remember in the early days, what was it like for an African American woman? What was it like for a woman? Do you remember any incidents, or was California always a more enlightened place than the rest of the country? And
well, I think that it wasn't. As I indicated, the fellow that I told you about that used to call to be sure that we were working on Martin Luther King's birthday.
He wasn't alone.
He wasn't alone. There were a lot like him, and we got a lot of calls like that. I can remember when we talked about access, when the More Universal Lifeline bill went through, people initially wanted to put that on the bottom of the bill where it came from, and people wanted to call me to talk to me about. We were talking about 1/2 of 1% or 1% penny or whatever it was. People didn't want to pay it, and so you get all kind of calls on that kind of thing. And the commission was referring them to me, and so it does. Some of those things are rough, and you do get a lot of people that raise a lot of questions. There are a lot of sometimes they're questions of color and those kinds of things. But I think overall, I think that California probably. There were people that had come before us, people like Yvonne, March Fong Yu, all had served in the legislature. Willie Brown, Merv Dimley had moved on at the time that I was elected, had been elected lieutenant governor. And so there were, and Wilson Rouse, superintendent of school, was African American, and so there were people. And I think that's when you really begin to appreciate the history and recognizing that people who go before you make it somewhat easier for you to come along in some areas, but they are never able to shelter you completely.
Yes.
So there are always going to be a few of the Archie Bunkers out there and others.
Do you think it's kind of an aberration right now, since the legislature has sent on so many distinguished women of color who have gone out and done glorious things, such as yourself in the private sector, such as Congresswomen right now, that there are no African American women in the legislature now?
I think that I think that that's an anomaly that just occurred, but I think that people are paying attention. There are no women in the legislature, but all the Congress people of color, of African American, are are women. So, I mean, on one hand, we lost all of the women. On the other hand, there's another. But I do think that there are people are looking at the legislation. I don't think it had anything to do with gender. And I think everybody kind of looked up, and when you tell people that, even in the African American community, I think that most people don't realize that occurred, and that people did what they're supposed to do. They voted for the person that they thought was the best, without giving gender consideration. But I think that we've come a long ways, and I think when people can really do that and really kind of look at whoever the best candidate may be. And I think that we kind of realized that. And we realized that with Diane Watson's election, where she was running against a number of incumbent people were there, and they did a little bit of everything to kind of discourage that. But I think that she held her own.
When you and she go back together a long time, and I know I've seen you together so often at conferences, and at the Center for American Women on Politics, we always talk about, did you talk to Gwen and Diane? Did you talk to Diane and Gwen? It was always, you worked closely together, and you were both very supportive of what we did always. Was there a group of women, was there a women's political community in the California legislature or in California women in politics that worked together across even party lines, across race lines, on some of these early agendas for women's lives, changes for women?
Oh, yeah, there are a number of groups in California and NWPC, a number of them were all supportive of us from the very beginning. There was the Tuesday group, which was one of my first real introductions into women in politics, and those were people like Roz Wyman and Liz Snyder, and women who had come along very early in politics, and they used to meet in the Bunker Hills Towers on Tuesday because they wanted to make a change, and they were some of the first, Joan Pileski, some of the women that really brought money and resources to women in politics and really sought to make a difference and a change. And in fact, that old Tuesday group got together about a year and a half ago, a couple of years ago, and it was really kind of fun to kind of see all the people that they had supported, because I can remember when that group started.
When was that?
That group must have started in like 1975 or something like that, or 75 or 76. And so they put together, when I first ran for public office, I got money from them, and Joan Pileski was, I think I got a check I got a huge check from her, which was huge at the time. But I think I got something like maybe $5,000 or something from her, which was just, for a school board race, which was just tremendous at the time. And I can remember when we kind of put together our little coalition with Kathleen and all of us, we sent out a memo, and I'll never forget it because they'd never done that in a nonpartisan race. We put Democrats listen or something, and I forgot. And we all swear to this day that got us elected. That otherwise we've never gotten anybody's attention. But there were those groups, and they're still out there. And I remember with NWPC and stuff, we were some of their first candidates, and so I always considered myself. I was the first group. I was the first person that it was the first time they were getting ready to make a decision. I was the first person that they interviewed. So we always considered me their rookie or their trial or their test case. But there's always been those groups that have worked together, and there is now a group that I'm working with. In fact, they're here. They were invited here, and that's the LAPAC, which is the Los Angeles African American Women's PAC. And we started that about 10 years ago, and they're going to celebrate their 10th anniversary with the Hall of Fame. And I'm helping to coordinate and actually chairing that Hall of Fame thing. But they're the only African Americans PAC in California, and probably the premier one nationally as a real startup. And they have hung in there and have been able to raise money and really make significant contributions of time and resources to women of color.
Say something about, for the record, about the Hall of Fame.
The Hall of Fame is going to be women who have made a difference in politics, and they're going to honor the first group in April, and
In California.
And actually they're going to take women from all over the country, so they're not going to just do Californians because they think it's significant and important that women know about women who have gone before, because we think it's important now. A lot of people forget about women and what they've done in women. We think it's important that people understand and know about women. Much of what you're doing here, we think that people really ought to know about some of these women that went before them. The other group, of course, is the National Organization of Black Elected Legislative Women, Noble Women, which Diane was chairing. We kind of founded that out of Rutgers. We all came together and kind of met and kind of thought that we ought to be doing something. And Diana Bourgeois is now chairman of that, is now the president of that group.
Diana Bourgeois from Louisiana.
Senator Diana Bourgeois. And so these are all people that have kind of met. A lot of us met around the table at Rutgers, and from a very early on, and friendships and needs out of what we were hearing and seeing here. And I hope that as we continue that, it's a very important part of the development and the evolving of women in politics is this ability to talk with one another. And I can remember sitting around and just really talking, and really I learned a whole lot of things about politics, even about chairing committees from people who had that opportunity. There weren't a lot of folks that had that opportunity, and so, but I can remember listening to people that Rutgers brought on as speakers, and so I thank you for that, because I think it really made a difference for me, and also knowing that you're there as a resource. And I think that the more that people hear and know about that, and know how easy it is to call and find out stuff, and that if you guys don't know, you'll find it for them, which has always been good for me.
Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. It really is. Sometimes it's hard to know, because you have ripple effects. People meet people, or something happens for them, and then it leads to something else. So it's great. Thank you for saying that, and I'll pass the word on to.
Well, we've always,
colleagues.
we were talking about that today, because we were looking at the panel that I was on, and Barbara, and if you'll remember the very first conference we came to in Cape Cod, we coming from the West Coast, it was Barbara and Shirley Hankins and Louise and Diane and myself and some of the others, and we met on the bus that took you from the airport to Cape Cod. And by the time we got there, it was like 10 o'clock or 10:30, and everybody had gone to bed. Well, we were coming from the West Coast, and we were wide awake. And so we stayed up talking and sitting around and bonded, I think, and we've been friends ever since. And whenever anybody was running, we talked, and it was cross-party lines.
Yeah. Barbara, you're referring to Barbara Roberts.
Barbara Roberts,
the former governor of Oregon.
And Marjorie, at that time, was a state representative.
Yes.
And Marjorie Hendricks and some of the other folks that you guys had brought out from there, and we just all stayed friends from then. And we've done a lot of things together over the years, and a lot of it, again, stemmed from that very first meeting and that time that we stayed up all night talking. And
Well, Cape Cod, just for the record, that was 1982. And
Was
the
that
reason
what it
I
was?
remember exactly when is that it was the 10th anniversary of the first conference
Right.
we ever held for elected women legislators. But it was also, if you remember, the moment in history when the Equal Rights Amendment
That's
and the extension battle failed. And people at that conference, this just brings a memory back. In Cape Cod, we had a conference of women state legislators came together, and people were coming in from their states where they had been fighting for this, fighting to get the amendment through, and it failed. And I remember one woman legislator getting up and saying that on her tombstone, she wanted it written, "I fought for the Equal Rights
That's
Amendment."
right, I remember that.
You
I remember
remember?
that. I remember
And
that.
then about 50 people got up and held hands and sang "We Shall Overcome," the women.
I remember that.
Oh, it was such a spontaneous and powerful moment.
There were a lot of people at that conference. Carrie Meeks, Elaine Siegel out of Florida. I mean, just a lot of folks that I remember who've gone on to
Carrie Meek went to Congress.
Congress and
Yes.
gone on and done other things. But,
So what does that say about today and young women? One of the issues at the conference here today, at this conference for women legislators, we reported some research which said that since 1988, which was the last time that we did a big survey of women state legislators, and now it's 2001, the age of women in the legislature has increased, not decreased. That women today are older in the legislature than they were in 1988, and that the proportion of women over age 50 in the legislature had grown. What does that say about young women coming into politics, about some of you out there making opportunities for young
don't
women?
make me old.
I'm asking it because I think of those women in Cape Cod and some of the people you're talking about, and it's just a great group of pioneering women, and we need to bring some others along too to join the crowd.
Well, I think
Expand
that,
it.
well, I guess what's scary about those numbers, it means that when this group leaves, and particularly those that are turned on the stage, there's not going to be anyone there, and that we're not electing them at the numbers that we had been. I don't think that's very true in California because we've got far more now than we've ever had. And I think that we really need to take a look at it. Because again, I think that if there's one thing about term limits, it's an equalizer. In the sense that people come in the same dumb. And, it's at the same place, so to speak. And I think that given that, women's life experiences prepare them in a different way to serve in legislative bodies than men. And that if you're all coming, most women that get elected get involved in issues and other things, and that's why they get there. A lot of the men that come for a variety of other reasons. And I think that when you gotta hit the ground running, that I think that there'll be a lot of women that are a little bit sharper, a little bit more experienced, and will have a chance for leadership. And I think that as women move into more leadership roles, you're going to see more women come back. And I think that's one of the things that we need to strive for, is to encourage and make sure that women are able to move rapidly into those leadership roles. That's why conferences like this are so important, because women can exchange and share and learn from one another about some of the movement. Because one of the things I hope, if I left nothing with that committee, is that you do not have to be the chair of a committee to make a difference. And I think that if people can hear that enough, and just different things like that, I think young women can be inspired and can really make a difference. And I trust when they move into a leadership role, we'll see more women being elected.
I was in a session at this conference today in which the panel on which I was speaking was looking at issues of young women and programs for young women in leadership. And we were contesting some of the statements that had been made earlier about young people being cynical. In our experience, there's less cynicism out there than there is a kind of sense of helplessness, or I can't really do anything that's going to make a difference. And I think, alas, I see a little bit more of that in young women than I do in young men. but maybe it's because I just see more young women. They are interested. They want to make a difference, but they feel as though somehow they don't have the support they need, that somehow they can't do it alone, they don't have the sense of agency, and I can get in there and take charge. What do you think about programs to help young women, and what kinds of specific things do you think they need? What would go into your ideal program?
First of all, I think that exposure is very important. And I think that a lot of young people don't really get the exposure. They really don't have any ideas about how to make things happen, or how political processes really work, or how to get involved. And I think
That's
that
right.
to that end, when you begin losing people, we've got to begin to develop some resources and outreach kind of activities that really bring people in and let them know. A lot of people would get involved in policies if they knew how. I mean, they don't know how easy it is to walk in and how people will jump on you and love you forever if you come in as a volunteer or whatever. We got to also work with helping people to understand that you don't always start at the top, and that there are some things that you can do, and really learn about being about part of things. A lot of things that we used to do, you used to volunteer because you wanted to know and you wanted to be about and you wanted to be a part of things. Don't get a lot of that now. Kids want to know how much they get paid. Or if it only pays minimum. I was trying to get some kids involved in a project. They said, that doesn't even work. That only pays minimum wage. That's not even worth me getting up for, you know. But I mean, I think that one of the things that we really, and I'm not so much on the points of light and all that, but I do believe that we have got to make opportunities for people to participate and be a part of things, and really do some outreach to really, try to involve young people and get them a part. We ought to be working with colleges and universities so that some of the courses or credit or some of the requirements, I tried to do some legislation where in high school that one of our civic classes is more than just the books, that you take them to the city council, make them write letters to the city councils on issues and stuff. Most of our kids get out of high school and don't even know how to make contact with an elected official, or that the elected official really works for them, other than talking about them badly. But if they really had an issue, they wouldn't know how to go about organizing and getting people to do it. And I think that we ought to do that in high school. Part of the civics that they learn there ought to be that. In college, to get out, you had to be a part of something. Because if we're talking about a democracy in this country, we had better learn how to involve people and make people feel a part of it, or else we're going to have some real problems as we move along in terms of
Now, these things that you're talking about, young men as well as young women need these kinds of things. Are there any things that you think of that young women may need special attention if they're going to be able to compete on an equal playing field with the young men as they
Well,
move
I think
into
that
politics?
one of the things, again, and I think that's one of the things that we as women do, is we don't put the proper value on our skills and our resources. And I think that young women probably do it more than young men. Most of them have some ego kind of thing where they think there's nothing they couldn't do, or that they can compete on any level. A lot of women, young women, think that they can't do it, so they won't even try. Young men seem to have no fear
You're absolutely
and are not embarrassed by,
Yes.
I mean, they overinflate what they think they can and what they are about. And I just think that we need to do some kind of work with women, or young women, helping them to evaluate their skills
confidence.
and self-esteem and that kind of thing, more than the touchy-feely kind of thing, but something where they really get some understanding of what it is that they're learning and how you transfer those skills to other kinds of activities.
And when you said they have to learn and come into contact, I thought back to the story you told about your son driving you around. I mean, you might have thought he was home and not interested and indifferent or not really aware of what you were doing. Turns out that when you have a mom who's in the legislature, you pick up an awful lot.
Yeah.
And you saw that. And that I think is a big issue. I think that people, if families aren't involved, their kids don't know about it. I'm a big believer in, the button that's around now, and there's a vote project, take your children to vote when you go to the booth on election day, and just let them see what it's like and what you're doing.
I think that's real important, because I think that to the extent that kids are exposed, the more they're exposed to things, the more that they can really be. There was a class in one of the San Diego schools where they had contact with an elementary school that actually got into a college where they could see, they were doing a dissecting a frog, and so they were going to let them into college. Most of them had family who had never been to college, had no idea even what a college classroom was like. Just being able to see into the classroom made a difference for some of these kids. I can do that. You know, I mean, it wasn't any different than a regular classroom and things like this, where they had all these visions of what college and stuff was about. And I think, again, it goes back to this notion of the exposure for people.
Access, exposure, access,
Well,
contact.
you know, and maybe that's one of the things that women legislators have to do, is to create an access for people to come behind them in terms of what you're doing. There's a lot of shadows. We usually look around, most of the shadows are young men. You know, we ought to do something more to reach out to get young women into that category.
You know, we're having this meeting that you're referring to here today it's happening a couple of months after this September 11th event, and people here are talking about new interest in government, new respect for political leaders, new patriotism, new feelings of community. The sort of thing that you're talking about when we say, you know, exposure. There seems to be a new exposure as a result of this. Are you seeing that in your community and in the people that you're coming into contact with? Do you think it will make a difference for getting people engaged?
Well, I think it does. All you have to do is go around and look at all the cars that have American flags flying off of them. I mean...
But what about long term? I don't mean now.
Well,
now, obviously, everybody is.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think that how does this not impact you some way long term? You think about the position that police and other people have been in, from pigs to other kinds of things, and the disrespect and stuff, and how so much of that has changed just by really seeing what it is that they really do. Most people, when they get exposed and see what happens in the legislature, and I'm not talking about, you know, because there's nothing worse than seeing laws being made, but when they go and they really see some of the discussion and some of the debate and really are able to hear some of the issues and how tough and complex they really are, people have a whole different respect for the law and things like that. And I think that the more we begin to do television, community television, where more people are watching the sessions of city councils and stuff that people thought at one time was boring, that people would never watch anymore. People are beginning to watch and really beginning to learn more about their communities and stuff. You know, and it's not a duty. They're doing it on their own. You know, they don't have to do it. But again, as you begin to really expose people and really make some requirements of them and their citizenship, we don't have to do anything to be a citizen here. But I mean, we ought to learn some of the citizen things that make you a good citizen. Participation in your government is one of them. And we need to think about ways on how we encourage people. Sometimes there are some things that are not negotiable, as I indicated earlier. Maybe this is one of them. And maybe we ought to do some things to focus more and bring more young people in and have them to do some things. We have all kind of requirements before you can graduate. And certainly one of them ought to be to have a better understanding of your government and some commitment to it.
I think this is kind of a nice segue into a broader question about how you reflect now. After all these years in leadership, you're still in leadership now. What have you learned about leadership over these years, personally and observing other people and the quality of leadership that they've brought to the task? What would you say about what you've learned about leadership?
Not much. I think that basically when you think in terms of leadership, there's certain elements of it that you want to be there. You want something that's constant, something that you can count on, someone that's knowledgeable,
So there were no big surprises along the way. You'd figured out a fair amount
Well,
early on.
well, I think there are
It
always.
sounds that way already.
I think that there are always surprises, but I think that as you grow and as you're exposed, again, exposure is everything.
Okay.
And you know the kind of things that you don't want to be or the things that you don't like in a leader or that you feel are necessary, and then you try to do those things. It's like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have. I mean, the kind of leader that you want to be, I mean, the things that you want to happen as a leader, you try to be those and you try to do those things. And I think that the more that you're exposed, the more you know what you don't want. And I think that you kind of grow into what you are based on what you know.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of convoluted, but
Well, I think it's one of the things in your next career, while you're still being the head of this, your own company and doing all these other things that you're doing, I hope it's going to be going into classrooms and going into places where you can talk in these ways, because exposure to you will inspire some people and young people, and you can teach a lot. I mean, you go back to the very beginning, you said you were teaching in the beginning. Well, I think, you've got so much to teach from all of this experience. I hope you do that. If you're not doing it already, I hope you include that in the things that you do in your busy life. And we can all, I think, look forward to you having a terrific impact on people if you do.
well, I think that we do have an opportunity to do that, and I've had an opportunity to kind of pick and choose and do things like that. And so it's something that I do enjoy doing and will continue to do.
Well, it has been a pleasure again, and I thank you again for agreeing to come and do this. And I hope we'll have more conversations in the future.
Thank
I
you for
want to
asking
thank
me.
you too, and to second what my colleague Ruth is saying, it's a kind of real no-nonsense leadership that I'm hearing, and I think this communicates itself very well to the next generation. So I too hope that you'll be talking with many more young people, because you're an inspiration.
Well, thank you, and it's nice to be here and hopefully be able to share some things that will help others to make a difference.